No power grid, no gas line, no wall you could lean against and feel warm air coming through a vent. Out on the frontier, the temperature made the decision for you. Either you found a way to hold on to heat, or the cold took everything from you by morning. In parts of the Dakota Territory and the high plains of Wyoming, a still January night could fall to 40 below before sunrise, and a cabin with a weak fire was just a slightly warmer version of the storm outside. One bad night, one log that didn't catch, one door that hadn't been sealed right. That was sometimes all it took to lose a child, or a grandmother, or an entire household. So families built systems, real ones, tested by trial and by loss, passed down because the families who didn't learn them didn't survive to raise the next generation. How did people with no electricity keep a cabin warm enough to sleep in when the world outside was trying to kill them? What tricks turned a pile of mud, moss, and old wool into something that worked better than you'd expect? And when the fire actually did go out at 3 in the morning, what did a father do in the 20 or 30 minutes he had before his kids were in real danger? That's what we're covering today. I'm Cass, and this is Cass Explains. The winter that people still talk about in old family letters from that region was 1886 into 1887, when a string of blizzards buried the plains for weeks and the mercury barely climbed above zero for most of January. Some families had already survived 2 or 3 winters out there and thought they knew what to expect. That winter told them otherwise. The ones who made it through weren't the toughest or the luckiest. They were the ones who'd built their heating, their walls, and their nightly routines around one simple fact. Heat doesn't wait for you to figure it out. You either had it ready or you didn't. Let's start with the fire itself, because everything else in the cabin depended on it. Picture a stone hearth against the far wall of a one-room cabin outside Cheyenne, snow packed halfway up the windows, wind pulling at the shingles above. A man named Elias Hendricks feeds another split log into a firebox nearly as deep as his forearm is long. His wife, Ruth, has already tucked their 3 kids under a mountain of quilts, each child pressed against a stone that spent the afternoon baking in the coals. The fire's been going since before supper, and it isn't going anywhere before dawn. That's not chance. That's a design they'd worked out over years. A fireplace built for real winter survival looked nothing like the decorative ones people picture today. The firebox went deep, sometimes deep enough to swallow logs 4 feet long, and the side walls angled inward so the heat bounced into the room instead of straight up the flue. Some families tilted the back wall forward on purpose, almost like a reflector, to push more warmth out toward the beds instead of losing it up the chimney. The damper wasn't just an on-off switch either. Families learned to read it the way a cook reads an oven, cracking it wider for a fast, hot burn, and closing it down when they needed the fire to hold steady for hours without eating through the woodpile. Wood choice mattered just as much as the fireplace design. Oak, hickory, and hard maple were the gold standard because they burned slow and left behind dense, glowing coals that kept radiating heat long after the flame itself had died down. Softer woods like pine got used for quick bursts of heat or for getting a fire going fast, never for the long overnight burn, and the wood had to be seasoned right. Green wood full of sap and moisture would hiss and smoke instead of burn clean, so families cut and split their winter supply in the spring and let it sit through summer and into fall, sometimes 6 months or more, until the ends cracked and the logs went light in the hand and rang almost hollow when you knocked 2 together. Loading the firebox was its own small craft. Big logs went to the back, packed tight, with smaller splits stacked in front where they could be adjusted through the night. The real secret was the coal bed underneath, a thick layer of glowing embers that could catch a fresh log almost instantly without needing to be coaxed back to life. Get that coal bed wrong and you'd spend half the night fighting a dying fire. Get it right and you barely had to touch the thing until morning. Banking a fire for the night took real judgment. Families would load in the heaviest hardwood they had, choke the damper down to slow the burn, and bury the coals under a layer of ash to keep them smoldering instead of blazing. Done properly, that fire would still have live coals waiting at dawn, ready to catch new kindling with a few breaths of air. Get the timing wrong, though, and you'd wake up to cold ash in a room already losing its warmth. Ruth Hendricks used to say, "A fire you can trust is worth more than a fire you can admire," and that line stuck with her kids long after they'd grown and left that cabin behind. It captured something families understood without needing to say it out loud. A fire had to be dependable, not impressive. None of this was safe by accident. A house fire on a night that cold could kill just as fast as freezing would. Families kept water close to the hearth, swept their chimneys regularly to stop creosote from building up, and drilled their children on what to do if flames ever got loose. Some households built a second, smaller heat source too, a bedroom stove or a metal brazier, so that one bad night with the main fireplace didn't mean the whole family froze. The same fire earned its keep in more than one way. A lot of families built the hearth wide enough to hang a pot or slide in a small baking oven right alongside the flames, so the wood that kept everyone warm also cooked supper and heated washwater. On land where every log had to be cut, hauled, split, and dried by hand, nobody wanted a fire that only did one job. The Hendricks place had an iron hook built right into the stonework for exactly that reason. Swung out for a kettle in the morning and swung back for the real work of keeping 4 people alive until sunrise. Now walk over to the wall of that same cabin and put your hand against it. Outside, it's 30 below. Inside, that wall is barely cool. That gap didn't come from luck either. It came from a wall built in 2 layers with a gap between them, packed full of whatever the land could provide for free. That double wall trick was the backbone of frontier insulation. An outer layer of logs faced the weather, an inner layer faced the room, and the space between them, usually 6 to 8 inches, got stuffed with material that trapped air the same way a modern jacket does. Dried moss was the go-to filler in a lot of regions, packed tight enough to create thousands of tiny pockets that held still air and stopped the cold from working its way through. Some families mixed in animal hair saved from butchering, or fur scraps, or even feathers, building up a barrier that did the same job as materials we'd recognize in outdoor gear today, just gathered from the woods instead of a factory. The gaps between logs got sealed with a clay and mud mixture called chinking, often blended with chopped straw or hair so it wouldn't crack apart as it dried. Applied in layers, that chinking stopped drafts from slipping in around every joint in the wall, which mattered more than people realize. A single narrow gap could undo an entire night's worth of careful fire management. The floor got the same attention. Families raised their cabin floors above a crawl space stuffed with dried leaves, straw, or old bedding, keeping the grounds cold from creeping up through the boards. Some even kept a few chickens down there, letting the birds' own body heat add a little extra warmth to the mix. Windows and doors, the weakest points in any cabin, got covered with heavy blankets or hung furs at night, and door edges were lined with leather or fur strips to choke off drafts. A few families built a small entry vestibule, basically an airlock made of wood and hide, so opening the door didn't send a blast of freezing air straight into the main room. The roof mattered too, since heat rises and looks for any way out. Thick sod roofs, layered over bark or split wood with moss and leaves packed between, kept both water and cold from getting through. The exact materials shifted depending on where a family had settled. Out on the open plains where timber was scarce, some households cut their walls straight from prairie sod instead of logs, stacking thick blocks of dense root-bound earth that held heat in a way surprisingly close to a modern earth-sheltered home. Families closer to pine forests leaned harder on bark and needles for their wall packing, while those near marshland made heavier use of cattail down and dried reeds. Nobody was following a manual. They were working with whatever the land around them actually offered, and the families who paid attention to their own terrain usually built the warmer cabin. None of it stayed fixed once it was built. Families checked their chinking all winter for cracks, topped up insulation wherever it settled or thinned, and treated even a small gap as a real problem, because a cold spot near a bed could mean frozen water by morning or a child too cold to actually sleep. If you want to see how these cabins actually went up log by log before the insulation ever went in, we've got a full episode on frontier cabin construction coming up soon. Even with a warm cabin, keeping a body warm through an 8 or 9 hour night took its own set of tricks, separate from the fire and the walls. Picture the Hendricks kids tucked into their shared bed, each one pressed against a stone that had spent hours in the coals, wrapped in wool, then buried under quilts and furs. That wasn't just cozy bedding. That was a small, deliberate heating system built around their own bodies. Clothing worked in layers, the same principle you'd find in any modern cold-weather gear, just built from wool and linen instead of synthetic fabric. A base layer against the skin, then wool shirts and vests, then a heavier outer layer on top, each one trapping a little more still air. Wool held on to its warmth even when damp with sweat, which is why families kept sheep specifically for it and why the women in a household could spend entire winters spinning and knitting just to keep everyone clothed for the next one. Heated stones did a lot of the nightly work. Families would warm large stones right in the coals until they were almost too hot to touch, wrap them in wool, and tuck them into bed an hour or two before anyone climbed in. A good stone could hold warmth for 6 or 7 hours, slowly giving it back all through the night. Some households used heated bricks instead, or metal pans filled with embers, whatever they had on hand. Sharing a bed wasn't just about space. It was strategy. Kids slept between adults so they'd benefit from the extra body heat a grown person puts off, and that arrangement alone kept plenty of children from slipping into hypothermia on the coldest nights. Beds themselves were built thick, with straw or feather mattresses to keep the cold floor from pulling heat straight out of a sleeping body, and some families built enclosed bed frames with curtains that could be drawn shut to trap warmth in a smaller space overnight. A hot meal or a warm drink before bed did real work too. Soup, tea, warm milk, anything that raised the body's internal temperature before the household settled in for the night. Since digestion itself generates heat and a warm drink gave an immediate boost that could carry someone through the coldest early hours. On nights when even that wasn't enough, families kept moving. Simple stretches, wiggling fingers and toes, short bursts of activity in a cramped room, anything to get the blood flowing and keep frostbite away from the extremities. Some parents taught their kids to cup their hands and breathe warm air into them, a small trick that made a real difference when fingers started going numb. Not every household did this the same way. A neighboring family a few miles off, the Okafors, who'd come out from a warmer climate entirely, leaned harder on the hot drink routine than the Hendricks did, keeping a kettle going most of the evening because they'd found their own bodies handled the cold better with steady, warm liquid than with heavy layering alone. There wasn't one correct method out there. There was whatever worked for your household, tested over enough winters that you trusted it without having to think it through each night. And every family had to know the early signs of hypothermia showing up in someone they loved. Shivering that wouldn't stop, confused speech, clumsy hands. Recognizing it early meant skin-to-skin contact right away. Warm liquids if the person could still swallow safely, and slow, careful rewarming instead of anything sudden that could send the body into shock. Dr. Nathaniel Reeves, a frontier physician who kept detailed notes through several brutal winters, wrote that a person's own body was the finest heater they'd ever own, provided they knew how to use it. That idea shows up again and again in old journals from the period, this quiet respect for the body as a tool, not just something to protect from the weather, but even the best system failed sometimes, and that's when real emergency protocol took over. Imagine Elias Hendricks waking at 3 a.m. to his youngest daughter's teeth chattering, his own breath visible in the dark cabin air. The fire's out. Outside, it's 40 below, and inside that number is climbing toward it fast. He's got maybe half an hour before this turns into something he can't fix. This is the moment every bit of preparation either pays off or doesn't. Families that took this seriously kept emergency fire-starting materials stashed in more than one spot around the cabin, dry tinder and kindling ready to go, even in conditions where a normal fire attempt would fail. Birch bark, pine pitch, and dried moss got gathered and stored in waterproof containers months ahead of time. Some households prepared char cloth, fabric partially burned in advance so it would catch a spark almost instantly, useful exactly when regular kindling was too cold or too damp to light easily. If someone was already showing signs of hypothermia, the fastest response was direct skin-to-skin contact, usually with the family member generating the most body heat, often a father or older brother. Cold, wet clothing came off immediately, and both people got wrapped together in dry blankets and furs while the fire got rebuilt. If the woodpile ran short in a real crisis, families burned whatever they had. Furniture, worn-out clothing, even pieces of the cabin itself if it came down to it, because keeping people alive always outranked keeping the house intact. Some families used a group formation to trap warmth when the fire couldn't be revived fast enough. The biggest, warmest adults formed an outer ring, kids and elders packed into the center, turning the family itself into a temporary heat source that could buy hours of survival even without a working fire. Emergency food mattered here too. Fat, honey, and small amounts of alcohol were kept on hand specifically because they raised core temperature quickly, used carefully, and in small amounts so they helped without causing other problems. When the whole cabin felt too big to heat fast enough, some families shrank their world down. Blankets and furniture pulled in close around the hearth created a smaller tent-like pocket that trapped heat in a fraction of the space, buying survivable warmth with a fraction of the fuel. And every household kept some way to call for help if things got bad enough. Smoke signals during daylight, reflected light or loud sounds at night, anything that could reach a neighboring cabin and bring someone running. Families understood the clock they were working against. At 40 below, an unheated cabin could become genuinely dangerous within 2 to 3 hours, and a person without shelter or heat was working in hours, not days. That knowledge is what made preparation feel less like caution and more like plain arithmetic. Daniel Whitfield, who wrote one of the more widely copied wilderness guides of the era, put it plainly. Out here, your plan has to work the first time, because there usually isn't a second one. Families took that to heart, checking their fire-starting kits on a set schedule, rotating out old fuel before it went bad, and testing any backup stove or brazier well before the first real cold snap, rather than waiting to find out it was broken during an actual crisis. The drilling went beyond equipment. Parents walked their kids through the same routine over and over on ordinary nights. Nothing dramatic, just quietly rehearsing who grabbed the tinderbox, who woke the youngest child, who got the water barrel checked, until the sequence stopped feeling like a lesson and started feeling automatic. That mattered more than any single tool in the cabin, because in a real crisis, there's no time to think through a plan you've never practiced. Staying warm was never really the point on its own. The point was a system built out of stone, wood, wool, mud, and their own bodies, one that could hold a family together through months that modern heating makes almost impossible to picture. Next time your furnace clicks off during a storm, you're leaning on some version of the same instincts these families spent generations refining by hand. Out on that frontier, knowing what to do mattered as much as being tough enough to do it. That's Cass Explains for today. Stay warm, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.